This chapter is legitimately one of the most disturbing things I've ever read. It comes from Dostoevsky's 1871 novel called Demons, or The Devils, or The Possessed. It is a dark, satirical, political, tragic comedy that is filled with brutal satire and severe criticism of Russian atheistic, utilitarian philosophy that was plaguing, according to Dostoevsky, Russian society at the time, which is what much of his work was dedicated towards disproving and showing to be detrimental to the human race and contrary to how humans live in general. So first I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the chapter, then I'm going to explain what happens in the chapter, then I'm going to share some pretty severe accusations that have been made against Dostoevsky because of this chapter, and then lastly I'll give some insight into the character that the chapter revolves around, Stavrogan, and show how that is related to the main theme or point that Dostoevsky is trying to make in the book. By the way, my name is David Curtis. Welcome to Reading Underground. This is my second video. I hope that you're enjoying it. I hope to be doing many more, maybe a video per week. If you like the video, please give me a comment, maybe like and subscribe if you feel that I've earned it. And if you want to follow me or support me, the links will be in the description below. Now, this chapter is called Stavrogan's Confession, and one of the reasons that you may have never heard of it or never read it is because it was never actually published in Dostoevsky's lifetime. When he sent it to his editor, Katkov was astonished by the chapter and refused to publish it. And this was really difficult for Dostoevsky to deal with because this chapter was actually one of the main cornerstones of this book that he needed in order for the book to make sense as a whole. And because he never could actually release it, he had to go back and do a lot of rewrites, and because of that there are some anachronisms, some inconsistencies, and some overall complexities that it's really hard to make sense of. Stavrogan is this enigmatic character who, without this chapter, which gives insight into his moral character, his depravity, his motivation, his inner torments, and his philosophy, he stays kind of enigmatic and difficult to sort of decipher. But it was discovered after Dostoevsky died in 1921 among some of his papers, and ever since it's been the subject of a lot of critical controversy. So what actually happens in this chapter? Well, Stavrogan goes to see this monk named Tikhon. Another name for the chapter is At Tikhon's. And he brings this confession, this written confession, to Tikhon to describe this horrible act that he committed. That is what makes the chapter so disturbing. In this confession, he admits to psychologically manipulating and then sexually assaulting or raping this really, really young girl. And then the young girl is so disturbed by the fact that she took part in this encounter that she hangs herself in a building outside of where Stavrogan was, and Stavrogan actually knew that she was going to do it, and he sat there and let her do it. And then he went and discovered her and essentially didn't take the blame for it and escaped. It is extremely difficult to read, and you might ask why Dostoevsky had to write something so dark, but it was essential for him to show how you absolutely cannot hold to this view of atheistic utilitarianism, this view that there is no objective morality that binds us, or a God that is going to judge us or bind us or hold us accountable to his moral law. And the truth is without objective morals, which Dostoevsky will claim all over his books and show that we aren't willing to abandon. I mean, you have characters like Ivan, who believes that there's no God, or at least rejects God on the basis of the suffering of children, and yet he can't reconcile this with the fact that he loves life and that he loves beauty and that he has a conscience. Same thing with Raskolnikov. He commits this murder and he doesn't believe in God. He doesn't think that he's going to be held responsible for it, thinks he's actually justified in doing it, and yet he can't live with himself, and yet his conscience torments him and he doesn't know why. Same thing here with Stavrogan is he commits this heinous crime, and yet he goes to Tikhon and he's tormented inside by what he did, and he would give anything to take it back. But at the same time, he's fighting back against that because he's sunk so deep into his egoism and his self-depravity, this love of debasing the self and of following the most, hedonistic and rational, overly rational side of the human race. And it's not simply because he's just a hedonist, but it's because he's trying to test this philosophy that he has and see if he can actually get away with it. But more on that later. One of the most interesting historical things that happened with this chapter is that Dostoevsky, to try to get the chapter published, he would come up with all these different variations to try to make it more suitable. And one variation, and he would actually go and read these variations to people that he knew and try to get their advice on it. And one of these variations involved a version where the young girl was brought to Stavrogan at a bathhouse or something like this. And there's this legend that haunts Dostoevsky's reputation to this day, that this is actually a confession of something that Dostoevsky did or had happened to him. Now, this was investigated by a guy named V.N. Zakharov. The original claim was that Dostoevsky showed up to Turgenev, who is another famous author from the 1800s who Dostoevsky very much knew, and Dostoevsky actually created this very severe and just very harsh caricature of Turgenev in The Demons. But the rumor is that Dostoevsky showed up at Turgenev's apartment and confessed this to him. But this was investigated and shown to be untrue. Zakharov went and found all the earliest attestations of this, account, and found that they were all contradictory to each other. And he actually knew enough about Turgenev and Dostoevsky's living situations that this meeting couldn't have actually physically taken place. Zakharov believes that Turgenev actually came up with this story as a sort of getting back at Dostoevsky for the caricature that Dostoevsky had of Turgenev. So Turgenev was going to have this caricature of Dostoevsky that had him doing all these horrible things or this horrible act. But that through the telling of this story, it became sort of miscommunicated. It was miscommunicated, and people actually started to believe that it was a real story. So now on to Stavrogan himself and what actually this chapter, it was trying to say, why it was so important to the novel. And there will be a longer video on Demons. It is so complex that it deserves like a full treatment, going through the Joseph Frank that expounds all of this stuff and explains it in great detail and shows how to actually get what Dostoevsky was trying to say, having had to read it after all the rewrites, and we can actually know what Dostoevsky was trying to say and what his message actually was. But we'll dive into that a little bit here because it's relevant to this chapter. So like I said, Stavrogan is testing his belief that there is no God, and he is sort of a pre-Nietzschean figure, a sort of pre-Nietzschean overman, or Übermensch, someone who has transcended good and evil. He's beyond good and evil. He's beyond the bounds of traditional Christian morality that had characterized Russian society and culture, let alone characterized human nature. That's something that we can't get away from, this love of life and this belief in moral ethics that we have to follow. And we do follow, because one of Dostoevsky's points is, well, you can say that God doesn't exist. You can say that there's not these moral boundaries that you can't cross over, but yet you're going to live as if they do exist. You're going to live as if love really does exist, because you wouldn't give up love. And actually, that's why Dostoevsky said that if he were to be shown that Jesus Christ was outside of the truth, he would stay with Jesus Christ rather than the truth. Now, this is obviously, it can be taken in a number of ways, but what Dostoevsky was really saying was, if you lose Christ, you lose everything that there is to be human, and everything that makes up the very essence of our lives, and how we treat our families, how we go about acting as if logic exists, and how we have all these presuppositions about the way that the world works and the things about life that we love. But we can't give those up. We won't give those up. And so it's like, you can say all you want that God doesn't exist and that morality is a social construct, and that we should focus on the social humanitarian progress of the culture above all things. And yet no one can actually live that way. And if they do, they'll descend into utter violence, chaos, moral collapse. And this is what we see in many of Dostoevsky's characters. Like I said, Raskolnikov, Ivan, and Stavrogin are three amazing, beautiful examples of this. So here's a quote from Stavrogin that kind of gives us some more insight into his character. He says, "I formulated for the first time in my life what appeared to be the rule of my life, namely that I neither know nor feel good and evil, and that I have not only lost any sense of it, but that there is neither good nor evil, which pleased me, and that it is just a prejudice, that I can be free from any prejudice. But that once I attain that degree of freedom, I am done for." So in the words of Joseph Frank, this horrible, disgusting act is this sort of, it's an escapade, a result of a grand moral philosophical experiment that he was trying to carry out in the real world. But in this chapter, no matter how far he goes with this, his conscience will not let him get away with it. He is bound by the reality of human nature, and that we've been embedded with the law of God on our hearts. And we can't get away from that no matter how hard we try to rationalize it. And if you read Dostoevsky, this is just everywhere in his writings, especially Notes from the Underground. The problem of the underground man is not that he is rejecting rationality and accepting the non-rational part of the human nature, but rather that he's overly rational, he's overly conscious. And this is obviously a criticism of this sort of rationalization that was going on in Russia at the time. Chernyshevsky had this view called rational egoism. And much of what Dostoevsky wrote is showing how, at least the implications of pure rationalism lead to heinous acts and things like this. A quote from Demons that shows Stavrogin's love of life and this sort of human nature that he can't escape from is shown in this quote here. This dream that he has of this perfect human paradise. I'll read it here. "A corner of the Greek archipelago, blue, caressing waves, islands and rocks, a foreshore covered in lush vegetation, a magic vista in the distance, a spellbinding sunset. It is impossible to describe it in words. Here was the cradle of European civilization. Here were the first scenes from mythology, man's paradise on earth. Here a beautiful race of men had lived. They rose and went to sleep happy and innocent. The woods were filled with their joyous songs. The great overflow of their untapped energies passed into love and unsophisticated gaiety. The sun shed its rays on these islands and that sea, rejoicing in its beautiful children. A wonderful dream, a sublime illusion, the most incredible dream that has ever been dreamed, but to which all mankind has devoted all its powers during the whole of its existence, for which it has died on the cross, and for which its prophets have been killed, without which nations will not live and cannot die." Frank says this vision of primeval earthly paradise and happiness and innocence fills Stavrogin's heart with overwhelming joy. He says, quote, "I woke and opened my eyes for the first time in my life, literally wet with tears. A feeling of happiness hitherto unknown to me pierced my heart till it ached." But then a tiny red spider associated with Stavrogin's subconscious with Matrosha's death, that's the girl that he violated, replaces this blissful vision of Eden. He sees the little girl in his mind's eye, standing on the threshold of his room and threatening him with her tiny fist. "Pity for her stabbed me," he writes, "a maddening pity, and I would have given my body to be torn to pieces if that would have been erased and never happened." Stavrogin finds this lacerating reminder of his own evil unbearable, but he willfully refuses to suppress the recollection. And this insupportable need to expiate his crime, which nothing he knows or believes in can help to absolve, is gradually driving him mad. Now, if you know Dostoevsky, if you know his writings, this sounds very familiar to you. For example, if you've read The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, it's this guy who's coming home and wants to commit suicide. He falls asleep on his desk with the gun in his hand and has a dream where he flies into this new perfect world where it's paradise, and it's this exact same sort of vision that Stavrogin is explaining here. And the guy in the dream causes the perfect world to become tainted with sin, and he sort of realizes that he has to take responsibility for sin himself, and only through the self-humbling and sort of bowing the knee to Christ and taking on the suffering of others can he overcome this trial that he's going through. You can also think of the dreams that Raskolnikov has all throughout Crime and Punishment. You can think of Ivan in this expression of love that he has for life and humanity, how he loves the sticky leaves and all these things. It's like he's so good at portraying these characters that are committed to this philosophy, and yet the way that they live, the way that they love, the way that they exist in the world does not comport with this view. And so it drives them insane over time. And that's what happens to Ivan in Brothers Karamazov. He goes crazy. He has a vision, which we don't know is real or not, of the devil and having this conversation with him. It's something that you're going to find all throughout Dostoevsky's works, and is crucial to understanding what Dostoevsky was really saying in Demons, and really in his broader corpus of work. Tikhon, and we'll end with this diagnosis Stavrogin here. He says, "This document," says Tikhon of his manuscript, "is born of a heart wounded unto death. But it is as though you were already hating and despising in advance all those who read what you had written, and challenging them to an encounter." Tikhon discerns that Stavrogin by himself can never achieve the true humility of genuine repentance. His need for suffering and martyrdom can thus lead only to more and more disastrous provocations. Hence, Tikhon urges that Stavrogin submit his will completely to the secret control of a saintly starets, and thus discipline himself by a total surrender to another, as the first step along the path to the acceptance of Christ and the hope of forgiveness. But Stavrogin, irritably breaking an ivory crucifix he has been fingering during his interview, rejects this final admonition and goes to his self-destruction. So this character of Stavrogin obviously is a, product of Dostoevsky's imagination, but Dostoevsky is pointing out to something very real in the Russian culture at that time, where he was saying this is the end of this view. If these intellectuals who were pushing so hard for this sort of view that held social humanitarian progress over all else, and this atheism, this view that God didn't exist, that this would be the result. This would be something that happens to Russia in an allegorical sense of it would be driven mad by this contradiction between its values that are embedded in the people that make up Russian culture versus this Enlightenment sort of atheistic utilitarian view that is utterly contradictory to not only these external beliefs, but just the way that they are made by God to live. So anyways, I hope you go and read this book. I hope you go and read this chapter. Of course, if you're in a good state of mind to do so. Again, we're going to do another video on Demons that's much more in-depth, and that explains a lot of what was going through Dostoevsky's mind and how to actually interpret the novel. But for now, I hope that gives you enough to, chew on and think about, and I'll be seeing you soon. Happy reading.